that being said, all the sentimental stuff out of the way, let's get back into the final segment, which is about the full mix treatment. Let's go to the slides on that. And the first thing I want to talk about actually is about the timeless nature or the time-bound nature of the music that you're working on. When I'm making records, I realize that sort of trends come and go, and both in terms of musical styles and production styles. I try to be aware that the music that I'm making in 2014 will not only be listened to in 2014, but hopefully will have legs and continue to be listened to for many years. So as I'm making my aesthetic choices, I try to make choices that are not gimmicky and will not later in history be locked into a certain time period. So there may be things that are super trendy to do right now, and you may choose to do them if that's what your client wishes, but I urge all of you to think about what you love about music today and also all of the music of the past that you enjoy, and what is it about that music that really wets your whistle. Is it a certain production aesthetic, or is it the songs? And what can you learn from the past that you can impart on the present, and what can you do in the present that's not going to damage this music's listenability in the future? Okay, so the first thing to talk about when doing a mix is how you're going to interact with your clients. Clients really hate being kept out of the loop. It is important that you get a chance to work on some stuff on your own where you don't have somebody leaning over your shoulder, but let them know that. Let them know that it's important for you to have some quiet time on your own to get the mix started and kind of happening and get a vibe for the mix going when you're not thinking about the person looking over your shoulder. You might be focusing on dialing in the guitar tone, but all the person in the back of the room can hear is this like annoying hi-hat thing happening, and their focus on that can distract your focus in that moment. So I think it's generally a good idea, unless you really require a lot of interaction from your clients. Get started on your own. Let them know that that's how you want to work, and then when you get to a point where you're either totally stumped and don't know what to do, or you're reasonably happy, maybe 85% happy with how things are feeling, then bring in the client and start soliciting opinions from them. But also make sure that they understand approximately what kind of schedule you're on. Say like, hey, give me all day tomorrow to work on it on my own. I'll get you some rough mixes tomorrow night. Don't leave them in the dark, or they'll feel confused, and you don't want to do anything that's going to cause your client to lose trust in you. You always want to make sure you foster an open relationship with them and build trust with them, because the more that they trust in you, the easier and better your working relationship will be. Okay, so your clients have a good understanding about what you're going to do. You have done all of your pre-mix work. You got your turbo tracks set up. You've got sort of some rudimentary automation set up on overheads and room mics, so you're following sort of the character of the song with that kind of stuff. You have your reverb sends that you want to use already set up, and your palette of vocal effects ready to go. You haven't necessarily applied a whole lot of them yet, but there's a palette ready to go, and then you start auditioning. Gear. One thing that I like to do actually right before I start auditioning gear is determine what my panning philosophy for the song will be. And I think about this a lot based on, first, on the quantity of guitar tracks I have. If I have a mono guitar track that's going to be panned, say, in the center, I might set up my drum set to sound super wide, or maybe even hyper-realistically wide. If I'm going for a hyper-realistic wide drum sound, I probably tracked it that way with the figure 8 overhead sort of aimed at the opposite side of the kit, so I can really super hard pan the cymbals. If I have a really dense mix of loud guitars, loud compressed sort of steady state guitars that are going to be hard panned, then my drum sound is going to be a little bit more in the center. I might even use a mono overhead, or maybe I only used a mono room mic, or maybe I have my 2 stereo room mics panned in quite far. And that's what I ended up doing on this Nice Hooves record. The toms are kind of hard panned, not hard panned, but the toms are kind of wide, but then with each successive instrument happening, or each successive element in time of the drums happening, it gets narrower and narrower. So the really close stuff in the drum set is happening in kind of a wide panning space, not hard pan, but a little on the wide side. Then the next thing that happens in time is the overheads. And then the final thing that happens in time is the room mics, which are much closer to the center. So you have, over time, it sort of does this and has a focus. You might want to take the complete opposite approach depending on the density of your guitars, and you might want to have a panning scheme that goes out like that. I find that in my studio with the diffused room mics that I use, it's really easy to make the two room mics feel disconnected from one another. So I tend to mix those closer to the center. The other thing that you want to think about is, particularly within the overheads, is where your pan controls are set is not really where the overhead panning really is, because there's always going to be crosstalk between the overhead mics, the left side of the overheads and the right side of the overheads if you're doing stereo overhead. So if you have your overhead pan set at 50%, the perception of that might only be 20%. So sometimes even like with if you're using like an XY type or Bloomline microphone directly over the kit, the stereo image of that is much more narrow inherently, even if it's hard pan, than if you have two figure eights sort of spread out over the kit. So keep that in mind as you're setting your overhead pan. And then the other thing to talk about is stylistic panning. Sometimes people are trying to paint a picture of, an organic image of what the band really sounds like when you're feeling that band playing live in front of you. But then other people don't care about that, and they're trying to present a more stylized version of what the song is. Maybe you're thinking about listening on headphones more than you're thinking about listening on speakers. You want to have a singer sort of whispering in your ear for a section, or you might want to have the drum set almost feel like it's double tracked and super hard panned, like some of the I love this band called Piss Jeans. I've never had a chance to work with them, but I know they have some records, and I don't think they double track the drums, but it almost sounds like there's no kick and snare in the middle. It's like real super wide, and it's an interesting sort of stylized approach. And so you got to decide if that's right for the song, or if more of like a organic, realistic representation of the band is right for the song. So once you've determined your panning philosophy, one more thing about panning before I forget is dealing with the mono guitar. If you have a band that's just one guitar player and they don't want to double themselves, there's a few things that you can do to deal with that. One, just mix it in mono straight up the middle. That's fine if you want to do that, but your center channel stuff can start getting cluttered. So maybe you might want to do a super wide drum set thing, or maybe you want to double the vocals or put a bunch of chorus on the vocals to make the vocals wide. You can do a rim mic, a mono rim mic on the guitar, pan the close mic to one side, pan the rim mic to the other side, like a Van Halen style thing. You can do a pseudo doubler. A popular way to do that in the 80s and 90s was with a Lexicon PCM42, which is a delay, but it also has this like limiter built into the front end of the delay. And I think it's like a 12-bit type digital processor, so it really changes the tone of the thing coming into it. So between the tonal shift and the limiter, if you have like your original guitar hard pan to one side and then the delayed version of it going through the PCM42 on the other side, it really does feel almost like there's two guitars coming to you. And you can do other things too. You can do subtle pitch variations. You can do other subtle delays and compression effects to make one guitar feel like a widespread stereo guitar. But if you do choose to do that, make sure you always check your mix in mono, because you want to make sure that there's always a mono compatibility with any mix that you do. A lot of TV sets, for example, if your song was played on television, a lot of TVs are mono. So you want to make sure that things don't collapse or sound weird if your song is played over mono. And also, if somebody has like a stereo system and they're sitting right in front of it, yeah, they're hearing stereo, but the further they get from it, the more because the speakers just from their perspective are getting closer and closer together, it essentially becomes mono at a distance. So if you use some sort of pseudo doubler effect, sometimes it feels natural when you're up close, but then when you get far away, it's got this weird chorused sound. So be careful about doing that. It's always a little bit of a challenge, and sometimes I'll just kind of force people to double track their guitars just to avoid that that headache of dealing with the mono guitar. But mono guitar is certainly not wrong, and if that's what works for the song, awesome. I talked yesterday a little bit about the headphones versus speakers thing, and that's about recognizing that when you're listening to something on headphones, you're listening in an unnatural environment where there's not crosstalk between the left and right speaker. So you might want to add some reverb or room mics to your guitars so that the guitars don't feel awkwardly isolated in any one channel. All right, so working with effects, short versus long reverb. I like to set up a number of reverbs, usually 2 to 3 reverbs in my mix. So I have a short reverb that I use to sort of add ambience to the mix and gel or glue the band together, make it feel like it's all coming from the same place. Sort of a similar role to what room mics do, but with a little bit more control. And I also like to use a long reverb for more special effects type of things. And I find that I'm sending sometimes lead guitar, sometimes snare or toms, sometimes vocals, sort of depends on the style of the music. You know, a lot of like the metal recordings I love from the 80s and 90s have some like real super long reverbs, and if I'm trying to conjure up that feeling, I'll grab a super long reverb. Tempo sync delays we sort of covered in the vocal section, so I'll skip over that. And the final thing I'll talk about is gimmicks, which really harkens back to what I was talking about making your songs timeless. You know, we're in Seattle right now, and home of Botch. And I remember Botch put out a record that had a, you know, I forget the name of the song, but it had this like lo-fi guitar, drum, radio thing that happened at the beginning of the song. And like, I hadn't really heard that before, that song. And I was like, whoa, this is fucking cool. And then everybody was like that. And then all of a sudden, over the next 5 years, everybody had lo-fi intros. And it was like, hey, let's mess with the kids and think it's a crappy recording, and they'll crank up their stereo, and then when the song comes in, bam! And then everybody was doing that, and it became this like very gimmicky thing. And I think it sort of became married to a certain time period.
Like the hidden track on CDs where you had to wait through 10 minutes of silence?
Exactly, like, yeah, we get it. We've done this before. And you know, I think the whole like the auto-tune effect thing is going to be that, and if not already, in a few years, people are going to know that that is locked into a certain time period. So as bands make requests for that thing, or bass drops, or whatever it happens to be aware that those gimmicks are going to be locked into a certain time period. And if they're insistent, trying to come up with a new way to do it. You know, you can do lo-fi intros by running a headphone mix and jamming like a 57 into the headphones and getting it that way. Or you can do it with EQs. You can find some crappy old, like, I have this crappy old Krone height filter that's not even audio equipment, it's like test equipment that I'll run stuff through and get that effect. And you know, there's all different ways to do it. So try to do it in new ways all the time. So at least if you're doing a gimmick, you've found a new way to do the gimmicks. You're not just repeating yourself over and over again. And of course, I always discourage that stuff, but I like stuff pretty natural and organic. Other people like stuff more stylized. Okay, so stereo bus processing. I want to spend quite a bit of time on this. I will do a fairly lengthy stereo bus chain. And it's one of those things where if you're not confident about it, you probably shouldn't do it, because it starts encroaching on the world of mastering. And just let me tell you what stereo bus processing is. So you're making a mix, and you know, you balance out all the various tracks in your mix, and then you have some kind of rockin' full mix. The dynamic range of that mix is much wider than what contemporary compact disc or MP3 or whatever will play. Typically, people prefer to reduce that dynamic range, compress the signal, and get it's partially to make the perceived volume of that louder, but it's also partially to provide sort of a glue and a cohesiveness that kind of gels the whole mix together. We're starting to sort of go against my philosophy of make your mixes timeless, because I think that hyper compressed mixes are finally starting to go away, and when people hear a hyper compressed super loud mix, they're going to associate that with a certain time period. So be a little bit wary of that, but a tasteful, well planned out stereo bus processing can do wonders for the cohesiveness of your mix. And if you're brave and you want to give it a try, I'm going to give you some tips on what you can do. So the pros for doing it, the main reason that I like to do it is that a mastering engineer is going to do some of that stuff. They're going to be doing a mix of EQing of your full mix, compressing of your full mix, limiting of your full mix, and sometimes they might even add reverb or DES your full mix. And that kind of stuff that they do can be a little bit hard to predict what the results will be from mix to master. If you do a little bit of processing on your own, then you'll have a better prediction of what the mastering engineer is going to do. Even if that processing doesn't get used in your final mix, to do sort of a bit of a fake master on your own mix might help you understand what's going to happen to the mix after it gets mastered. The other reason to do it is if you do some stereo bus processing at your end, then the mastering engineer doesn't have to do as much at their end. They'll process your mix with a lighter touch, and it should give it a greater sense of transparency. The reason not to do it is, especially if you don't have nice quality gear, or you're a little bit confused as to what sounds better or worse, if there's any doubt in your mind, be very wary of doing it, because it does limit what a mastering engineer can do. You're reducing the headroom of your mix when you do the stereo bus processing, so the mastering engineer has less room to work. So an interim solution to that is actually print two versions of the mix. Print your version that has the stereo bus processing, that's your best guess as to what it should be, and then also print an unprocessed version of the mix, and send both versions to the mastering engineer and let that person choose which version is a better starting point for their master. So the solution that I have, and I kind of messed up actually, I meant to print mixes of my, print versions of my mix with no master bus processing and with master bus processing, so I could illustrate the difference and how that changes my mix. I messed up, I forgot to do it. I apologize for that, because I think it's pretty enlightening. So the chain that I've been using over the past couple years for my master bus processing is fairly lengthy. The first thing I go into is a device called an Avonson blend, which is actually a wet-dry control of the stereo mix. So it has in and out, but then it also has like a loop in and out, and then there's a crossfader. So it's like you're a DJ. You can just cut and scratch and that stuff. So basically, all the way to the wet side is as if the device is not in the chain at all. All the way to the dry side is as if it's bypassed. And then somewhere in the middle is usually where I live. So what I can do is do some kind of heavy master bus processing, be super heavy-handed and really get a vibe, but then back off on that. It's sort of like the parallel compression technique you hear people talk about a lot with what they're doing on their drums, only I'm doing this on the entire mix. Alan Douch has actually kind of turned me on to this. People do it a lot with SSL consoles or other consoles that have a lot of buses on them, where they'll have kind of like a cleaner bus and then a more affected bus, and then they'll blend the two out their stereo output. I'm doing it with this thing called an Avonson blend. So then after the blend, or in the loop of the blend, I have three devices. The first one is a TubeTech SMC2B, I believe is the model number, which is a tube compressor, multi-band tube compressor, which allows me to compress the high, mid, and low bands independently of each other. So I'll go in and I'll kind of dial in crossover points there's two crossovers in that. One determines where the separation is between high and mid. Another crossover point determines the separation between mid and low. Kind of dial up what my crossover points are going to be, figure out where I want the high stuff to, or what frequencies I want control of for the highs, the mids, and the lows, and then I'll do some independent compression of each of those. So it lets me, what that means is that, you know, when a snare drum hits, it compresses the mid-range stuff, but it doesn't compress the bass guitar, for example. But when the bass drum and the bass guitar hit, it's not going to cause the cymbals to duck out of the way. So you can have a level that's more range controlled with more transparency because individual bands are not affecting each other. So that's the thing that really takes my mix from sounding like a rough mix to a finished mix. Following that, I go into an equalizer called the Dangerous Back EQ, which is a really nice sounding equalizer. It has a high pass filter that I use to remove some rumble. Most speaker systems can't reproduce the ultra sub bass anyway, so just get it out of the way so that it's not driving the compression too much, and it's not in the audible range of most people's stereos, so you don't need it in your mix. I'll also boost a little bit of sparkle with that thing, and I'll boost a little bit of like the high bass with that thing to sort of compensate for the sub bass that I'm removing. So it actually it feels like it has a greater bass content, even though in actuality it's not reproducing fundamental frequencies as low as it did without that EQ in the chain. Then I'll add a little bit of sparkle on top if the mix needs it, and then finally I'm going into a Dramastic Audio Obsidian, which is an SSL style stereo bus compressor. And that's operating at pretty fast settings, but low ratio, and just kind of grabbing the peaks and tucking things in. So what happens a lot in mastering is that things that are steady state, like guitar, the volume of guitar is pretty steady. If you look at the waveform of a guitar, the volume of snare drums and bass drums, you're going up and down all over the place. So combine those, and you got all this stuff. So then you start limiting it, and now kicks and snares are getting squashed in. So I like having this Dramastic Audio Obsidian there, so I can do a little bit of that kick and snare squash that I know is going to happen in mastering at my stage. And then because I'm doing that during mixing, I can judge what the final balances of all the instruments are going to be after mastering a little bit better than if I was just guessing how much squash the mastering engineer is going to do. So just quick aside while I'm on that topic, if in doubt, always mix the close mics of the drums a little louder, because if they end up too loud in the final master, the mastering engineer can just squash it a little bit harder and tuck the drums in a little bit more. If the drums are not loud enough, it's a little bit more involved process to try to bring out the drums. So just stepped you through the three pieces of gear in my chain: the Tube Tech, the Bax EQ, and the Obsidian, and then kind of dial those in to get the mix feeling kind of hot and super rockin', and then go back to my Avildsen blend, back off on the ratio control, and restore some of the organic, natural feeling of the mix without the two bus processing. And then finally, after that, it usually either goes to tape with I have an Ampex ATR 102 half-inch or quarter-inch tape machine, or actually the UAD Ampex plugin is quite good. I've been using that a lot lately. So that's usually the final thing that I do in my mix. All right, and the other thing I should mention is the stereo bus processing. I don't wait until the very end of the process to set that up. I do that sort of in the middle of the mix process. It's actually one of the first things that I'll patch in, and I'll have kind of some basic settings on that I know that I like. And I'll be monitoring through that as I'm making my other mix decisions. So, and a mastering engineer doesn't really have that benefit of being able to rebalance all the individual elements of the mix as they're mastering. But since you have like a bit of a pseudo mastering chain going on now, you still have the opportunity to go back and rebalance all the individual tracks. I also find that using that master bus processing means that your individual tracks do not require as much processing on their own. So now Now that we've got our master bus processing on there, we want to start listening to the mix as a whole. And at this point, you really want to start filtering out all the tech minutia and start really listening to the song and figure out what the vibe of the song is and what does the song need. Now, you know, I know that you've got great ownership over all of the awesome engineering that you did and all these super creative ways that you came about all of these sounds, but none of that stuff matters anymore. The only thing that matters is what's the best result for the song. You're super proud of yourself that you know, recorded the snare drum through a vacuum cleaner hose with some weird mic on the other end and all that, but if it sounds stupid in the song, then you don't use it. Simple as that. So listen to the song, listen to the voice of the song, and make sure that everything the song does is supporting the voice, and put yourself in the shoes of the listener and start thinking about how the song emotes and what is going to resonate most with the listener of that song.